I want to tell you how this story ends first. Because the ending is the only part that matters. On a Thursday morning in October, a lawyer named Graham Ashby called my home telephone at 8:14 in the morning. He represented my son Nathan. He was calling, he said, in a professional capacity, regarding the estate of my late husband Arthur Chambers, and the assets he believed were outstanding and unaccounted for. He used that word carefully. Unaccounted for. I was sitting at my kitchen table when he called, drinking my second cup of coffee, watching the light come through the window and land on Arthur's rose garden the way it always did at that hour. Slow and golden, moving through the October leaves like something that knew exactly where it was going. I let Graham Ashby finish speaking. Then I said very pleasantly, "Mr. Ashby, I appreciate the call. But there is nothing unaccounted for. Everything has been accounted for. Precisely, legally, and completely. For the past 5 years. Then, Mrs. Chambers, my client believes there may be an account that was not disclosed during the estate proceedings." Picked up my coffee cup, took one slow sip, and I said, "Your client is correct. There was an account. There still is. And everything in it belongs entirely to me. Arthur made certain of that 31 years ago. Would you like me to have my attorney send you the documentation?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted 11 seconds. Counted. Then Graham Ashby said, "I will need to discuss this with my client." "Course," I said. "Tell Nathan I said hello." Hung up. I looked out at Arthur's roses. And I thought, 31 years, Arthur. We planned this 31 years ago. And it worked exactly the way you said it would. If you have ever watched someone underestimate you so completely that you had to stop yourself from laughing, stay with me. Because what my son believed he was entitled to, and what he actually received, are a story 31 years in the making. And I promise you, he never saw a single moment of it coming. My name is Eleanor Chambers. I am 69 years old. For 34 years I served as president of Cornerstone Regional Bank in Richmond, Virginia, an institution with $4 billion in assets, 9 branch locations, and a board of directors that had not included a woman until I walked into the room in 1987 and declined to walk back out. I retired 6 years ago. My son Nathan believed that retirement meant I had lost my understanding of how money moves. He was, in the particular way of people who have never built anything themselves, catastrophically wrong. My husband Arthur died 5 years ago. Congestive heart failure. Slow and deliberate. The way that particular illness tends to announce itself over years before it finally arrives. Arthur had been a civil engineer for 40 years, a quiet and meticulous man who believed that the most important structures are the ones nobody sees. The foundations, the load-bearing walls, the systems built to hold everything else up. He spent the last summer of his life in our backyard on Sycamore Hill Road planting a rose garden. 47 roses. Every variety he could find. He said, "Eleanor, I want you to have something that blooms after I am gone." He was that kind of man. The rose garden still blooms every May without fail. I have never cut a single one. Nathan was not always the man who hired a lawyer to call his mother at 8:14 in the morning. He was the boy who used to follow Arthur around the backyard on Saturday mornings, handing him tools he couldn't name yet, asking questions about load and tension and why bridges didn't fall down. He was the boy who, at 17, spent an entire weekend building a bookshelf for my office because I had mentioned once, offhand, that I had run out of room for my reference volumes. The bookshelf was slightly uneven. I kept it for 20 years anyway, because he had built it with his own hands, and that meant everything. Nathan changed after he married Brittany. I want to be careful here because Brittany is not the architect of this story. She is simply a woman who saw a bank president mother-in-law and calculated, incorrectly, that proximity to that title would eventually translate to access to what came with it. Nathan had always been susceptible to other people's calculations. It was the one quality Arthur and I had never been able to engineer out of him. Arthur and I had our first conversation about the account on a Sunday afternoon in July, 31 years ago. We were sitting on the back porch. The roses were not there yet. That would come 30 years later, in Arthur's last summer. What was there was a legal pad, a pen, and Arthur's reading glasses pushed up on his forehead the way they always were when he was thinking carefully about something structural. "Eleanor," he said, setting down his coffee, "I want to talk to you about what happens after I am gone." I told him he was being morbid. He told me he was being an engineer. He said, "I have watched you build something extraordinary. And I know how people behave around extraordinary things when the person who built them is no longer in the room. I want to make sure that what you built stays yours. Completely and irrevocably yours." I looked at my husband. This quiet, meticulous man who thought in load-bearing walls and foundations. I said, "What are you proposing?" He slid the legal pad across to me. He had already drawn up the structure. The account was opened the following Tuesday. It was titled solely in my name. It was structured as a separate property trust under Virginia law, established during our marriage with full legal documentation, signed by both of us, witnessed by our attorney James Bellingham, and registered with the Commonwealth of Virginia. Arthur had spent 3 weeks researching Virginia marital property law before he drew that diagram on the legal pad. He was, as I have said, an engineer. He understood foundations. Over the following 30 years, we contributed to that account steadily and quietly. Not dramatically. Not in large visible amounts. The way you build anything that is meant to last. Slowly, carefully, with attention to every joint and seam. By the time Arthur died, the account held $2.3 million. I did not disclose it during the estate proceedings. I was not legally required to. James Bellingham had made certain of that 31 years ago. Nathan began changing toward me approximately 14 months after Arthur's funeral. At first it was subtle. The phone calls that used to come every Sunday began arriving every other Sunday, then monthly, then only when there was something specific he needed to discuss. Then came the visits that felt less like visits and more like inspections. He would walk through my house on Sycamore Hill Road with a particular quality of attention. Not the attention of a son checking on his mother, but the attention of someone taking inventory. "Noticed." I said nothing. I had spent 34 years as a bank president. I knew exactly what a person looked like when they were calculating the value of something that did not yet belong to them. The first direct conversation happened on a Wednesday evening 18 months after Arthur died. Nathan sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I had drunk coffee and watched the October light move through Arthur's roses, and he said, in the careful voice of a man who has rehearsed this, that he and Brittany had been thinking about their financial future. That things were tighter than he had expected. That he felt certain Dad would have wanted to make sure the family was taken care of. That perhaps it was time to think about restructuring some of the estate assets. I looked at my son. I offered him more coffee. I said, "Nathan, your father's estate was settled completely and legally 14 months ago. Everything was distributed according to his wishes. There is nothing left to restructure." He nodded slowly. He said, "Of course, Mom. I just meant if there was anything you wanted to think about going forward. For the family. For the family." I recognized that phrase. I had heard it in boardrooms for 34 years. It always meant the same thing. Meant for me. The requests came in 4 installments over the following year. The first was modest. $15,000 for a business venture Nathan described as a sure thing that simply needed initial capital. He declined. He looked surprised. The second was larger. $40,000 framed as a loan for a real estate investment that he and Brittany had identified in the Shenandoah Valley. I declined again. His surprise had begun to calcify into something harder. The third request arrived not from Nathan but from Brittany, in a handwritten note that described, in considerable detail, how much Nathan had sacrificed over the years to be close to his parents, how little he had asked for in return, and how meaningful it would be if I could find it in my heart to help them establish financial security while I was still in a position to do so. While I was still in a position to do so. I read that note 3 times. I placed it in the top drawer of Arthur's old desk in the study. I said nothing. The fourth request came from a lawyer. Not Graham Ashby. A different one. A woman named Patricia Voss, who called on a Tuesday morning to inform me that Nathan had retained her to conduct an informal review of Arthur's estate, as he had reason to believe the original proceedings may have been incomplete. I listened to Patricia Voss for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then I said, Ms. Voss, I would suggest you advise your client to be very certain before he pursues this line of inquiry. And I would suggest you speak to James Bellingham before you take another step. Who is James Bellingham? She asked. My attorney, I said. Of 31 years. Tell him Eleanor sent you. She called back the following morning to say that her client had decided not to pursue the matter at this time. But what I didn't know yet, what I had no way of knowing sitting at that kitchen table with Arthur's roses blooming outside the window, was that Nathan had not given up. He had simply hired someone new. My colleague at Cornerstone, a woman named Margaret Finch, who had been my deputy president for 11 years and who understood the architecture of financial structures the way Arthur had understood the architecture of bridges, came to see me on a Saturday in August. She brought coffee cake from the bakery on Monument Avenue. She set it on my kitchen table. She said, Eleanor, I need to tell you something. And I need you to hear it as a friend, not as a banker. She told me carefully. Nathan had been making inquiries. Not through lawyers this time. Through people, mutual acquaintances, former colleagues, anyone who might have known Arthur well enough to know what he had built and where he might have kept it. He had been doing this for 7 months. Margaret had heard 3 separate accounts of these conversations before she felt she could no longer stay quiet. I listened to everything she said. I thanked her for the coffee cake. I walked her to the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the photograph of Arthur and me on our wedding day that had hung there for 40 years. Then I went to my study. I opened the top drawer of Arthur's desk. I found the card for James Bellingham, which I had not needed to use in 2 years. And I called him. Not because I was worried. Because I wanted to make certain that every foundation Arthur and I had built 31 years ago was exactly as solid as we had designed it to be. It was. Every joint. Every seam. Every load-bearing wall. James confirmed it in 40 minutes. Thanked him. I went back to the kitchen. I poured a second cup of coffee. And I waited for Graham Ashby to call. Nathan found out the full details on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after Graham Ashby's phone call to me. James Bellingham had sent the documentation to Graham Ashby's office on Wednesday morning, all 47 pages of it, organized with the precision of a man who had been anticipating this moment for 31 years. Nathan called me at 3:47 in the afternoon. I was in Arthur's rose garden when the phone rang. It was October, and the last of the season's blooms were still holding on. A particular deep red variety Arthur had called his favorite, though he claimed every year that his favorite was whichever one had opened most recently. I answered on the 3rd ring. Nathan's voice was not the voice of the man who had sent lawyers and made inquiries and spent 7 months asking quiet questions of mutual acquaintances. It was the voice of the boy who had handed his father tools he couldn't name yet, asking questions about why things held together. Mom, he said. Nathan, I said. The count, he stopped. Started again. The count Dad set up. It's been there the whole time. Yes, I said. And it's... His voice broke slightly on the edge of the word. It's all yours. Has always been all mine, I said. Your father made certain of that. 31 years ago. A long silence. Why didn't you tell me? He said. 'Cause I said you never asked how things were built, Nathan. You only ever asked what they were worth. The silence that followed was the longest one. When he spoke again, his voice had changed into something I had not heard from him in a very long time. Something quieter, younger. The voice of a boy in a backyard, handing his father a wrench. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. I don't know when I stopped, he paused. I don't know when I stopped seeing you as a person. I looked at Arthur's roses. The deep red ones, still holding on in the October cold. I know, I said. That is why your father built what he built. Not to punish you. To protect me. Because he loved me enough to think 31 years ahead. Another silence. What happens now? Nathan asked. Now, I said, you go home. You think carefully about the kind of son you want to be. Not to my account. Me. Hung up. I stood in Arthur's rose garden for a long time. The October light moved through the leaves the way it always did at that hour. Slow and golden. Knowing exactly where it was going. I am 69 years old. I spent 34 years building structures that other people would trust with everything they had. I understood better than most that the most important part of any structure is never the visible part. It is the foundation. The thing built quietly, carefully, in advance, long before anyone knew it would be needed. Arthur understood that too. He was an engineer. He thought in load-bearing walls. He planted roses that would bloom after he was gone. And 31 years before he died, he sat on a back porch with a legal pad and a pen and designed a structure so solid, so carefully documented, so precisely constructed, that not a single lawyer, not a single inquiry, not 7 months of quiet questions could find a crack in it. 'Cause there were no cracks. Arthur had checked every joint. What my son never understood, what people who calculate the value of things never understand, is that the woman who spent 34 years managing $4 billion does not stop understanding money the moment she leaves the building. She simply decides what to do with that understanding on her own terms. Nathan came to see me 6 weeks later. Alone. He knocked. He sat at my kitchen table. He did not ask about the account. He asked about Arthur. About the rose garden. About which variety was Arthur's favorite. I told him about the deep red ones. The ones that held on longest in the cold. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Can I come back next weekend and help you winterize the garden? Dad used to do it every year and he stopped. I never learned how." I looked at my son. 43 years old. Arthur's hands. Arthur's jawline. A man who had gotten very lost and was now, slowly, trying to find the path back. Said yes, come Saturday morning. I will have coffee ready. He came on Saturday. We winterized the roses together. He asked questions the whole time. About the roots. About the soil. About how deep the mulch needed to go to protect them through the winter. He sounded, for the first time in years, like the boy who had asked his father why bridges didn't fall down. Before he left, he stood at the edge of the garden and looked at the 47 roses, all carefully covered now, waiting for spring. He said, "Dad really planted all of these himself." "Every one," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He must have loved you very much." I looked at the garden. I thought about a Sunday afternoon 31 years ago. Legal pad. Pen. Reading glasses pushed up on a forehead. An engineer who thought 31 years ahead. "Yes," I said. He really did. The foundation is never the part you see. It is the part that holds everything else up long after the person who built it is gone. Arthur knew that. He built accordingly. Was there a moment in this story where you understood what Arthur had really done? Not just with the money, but with the message he left behind. Tell me in the comments. I want to know exactly when it landed for you. Share this with someone who has been underestimated by people who only see what things are worth, not what it took to build them. And if you are not yet subscribed to Grandma's Moments, do it now. The next story begins with a grandmother who answers a phone call meant for her son. What she hears on that call will change everything she thought she knew about her own family.